Hello and welcome to Dialogue. International political and business leaders are attending the annual World Economic Forum this week in Davos, Switzerland, where they are looking at how to restore economic stability and business confidence in an era of high interest rates, rising inflation, geopolitical uncertainty, and climate chaos. Chinese Vice President Liu He addressed the meeting, saying that China welcomes international investment and the door to China will only open up further. What's on the agenda at the Davos Forum? How can leaders deal with a deglobalizing world? And where are the economic forecasts for China and the world in the new year? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined today by Liu Zhiqian, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University of China, and Yi Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Steve Ken, crowd-funded professor of economics on Patron. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. Andy, I will start with you. A record number of 2,700 of the world's political and business elites are gathering in the Swiss ski resort city of Davos for the first in-person meeting of the World Economic Forum in 2 years. So what's the key message out of this meeting?
Well, Qingduo, Davos is a convocation or a get-together of the world's elite. Sometimes the people that attend are called Davos man, which includes both men and women. And of course, the key challenge or the opportunity to be discussed is globalization. And while for every Davos, there's always the theme that globalization is under threat. This year, I think the sense of crisis is much greater, and the term polycrisis is used to describe what's going on. Not only the uncertain macroeconomic environment, the conflict in Ukraine, many countries are still dealing with the aftermath of COVID. So the word polycrisis, I think, describes where we are today.
Well, Steve King, the theme of this year's meeting, cooperation in fragmenting the world, I guess it has a lot to do with globalization, or the opposite, deglobalizing or deglobalization, fragmented world. Tell us, what does that mean? We try to seek cooperation in the fragmented world, and how fragmented it is with polycrisis.
Well, extremely fragmented. And the most important point is the coming impact of climate change, which I'm sure virtually everybody at that meeting is underestimating what's actually going to be implied by it. But we've seen the beginnings of that with the impact that COVID had on global supply chains. And we have got used to the global supply chain being as extended and detailed as it is now. But it's a total aberration in human history that, for example, the iPhone has parts which are manufactured in over 100 countries. That's an incredibly intricate and very fragile supply chain. And if I take Nicholas Taleb's idea of anti-fragile, we need a world which is anti-fragile. And that means one which can cope with shocks, which can cope with disturbances. And clearly that's not a globalized world. So part of that fragmentation is necessary to build a more robust industrial structure where if you lose supplies from one country, it doesn't mean you can't continue manufacturing. Because that's been the case we've been in, and it was really highlighted by COVID. It's going to get worse with climate change. So we have to fragment, and we have to do that in a cooperative manner. I'm very lacking in confidence that will actually be the outcome of Davos.
Well, anti-fragile, Steve, does that mean the cost may be higher?
Costs will have to be higher. We've had an artificially low cost for the last 40 years, and a major reason for it is simply a shift from high wage to low wage employees from America to China. That was a huge part of China's very successful industrialization. Of course, it had to come to an end. China's incomes, as you'd be quite aware, are substantially higher in practical terms than people in the West actually believe. China really has succeeded out of this. But of course, that then eliminates the wage advantage to some degree. Now, if we do move back to production being relocated back in America for reasons of robustness rather than than low prices, then of course costs are going to rise. And a major part of the inflation we've seen hasn't come out of wage demands by any stretch of imagination. It's come out of the supply chain taking longer and therefore cost rising, and that's going to be a continuing trend.
So we are paying a price. 之前 obviously, it's not a globalization or more globalization and more. It seems, at least, people are talking about the deglobalizing or reglobalizing. What do those terms mean? For people who are not familiar probably with what's ongoing around the world economically here.
I should say that in the past 30 years, that the whole world is undertaken the globalization. All countries and the peoples and the economists and the private persons and entrepreneurs, they have the benefits from the globalization. Not because of some Western major countries that they uphold their protectionism and made their separatism and also try to decoupling from the other developing countries, including China and other countries. So this is why that made this world and global community at the moment is in chaos. Now some people that are so optimistic that are trying to say this, the meeting this year in Davos could build up a globalization. But I think this is a long process. It's not easy to get the globalization because this is globalization should be discussed, should be agreed, should be accepted by all major countries in the world. But I don't think at the moment that the Western countries, including the United States and some major European countries, they are still fighting against this globalization. Theoretically, yes, they say that they wish to have globalization, but in fact, in the action that they try to decoupling, also decoupling from the globalization. So re-globalization is only a goodwill and good wishes of the developing countries, but it will need a lot of efforts and a long time to get this goal. This is a long time goal, achieved will be in 5 or 10 years, but at the moment we still have more complex competition between each other because we don't have enough trust, mutual trust between countries, especially developing countries and the Western major countries. So we hope that this process can still going on. We should not give up our effort to strive for the globalization or re-globalization. But anyhow, that we should fight against the so-called decoupling or the evil will that to have competition against the rise of the developing countries. This is what we should consider to find a good solution in this Davos meeting.
Well, this is a changing world. Andy, a recent IMF report said fragmentation could cost the global economy up to 7% of global GDP. Depending on the definition, of course, of fragmentation. Some forecasts by the IMF suggest that countries could lose up to 12% of their GDP if fragmentation, it's obviously detrimental to the economies of countries around the world. But why it continues, and what are the motivating factors behind this trend?
Well, Ching, to us, certainly, when we hear numbers like this, it can be cause for concern and even alarm. But I would actually take a more optimistic position on this than our two other guests tonight. So while certainly there are challenges between China and the United States in terms of trade and investment, if we look at the global picture, in fact, ties between China and many other parts of the world, including Europe, are actually growing and deepening. Let me give Latin America as an example, which is in the United States' quote unquote backyard. And even in Latin America, investment and trade with China is increasing significantly. So I think the long-term picture is actually quite positive for globalization, greater trade and investment ties. That being said, in the short term, We face enormous challenges from recovery from COVID. What happens with the US-China relationship obviously will have a big impact on global growth statistics, as well as what the US does in terms of monetary policy. As we've heard from senior Chinese officials, that the US government needs to consider the global impact of its responses to American domestic challenges. So I would not discount the challenges in the short term globally, but I'm much more optimistic about the continuation of globalization in the long run. But globalization where China becomes more of the engine, as well as more of the one of the main actors in ensuring that globalization does continue in an economically and a environmentally sustainable way.
Well, Andy, here's an interesting remark recently by Stephen Roach, the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and now a faculty member at Yale University. He said in Hong Kong recently that one of the big surprises to him and most is that things have got worse under Joe Biden than they were under Donald Trump, who was talking about China-US relationship. So what kind of a role do you think the U.S. or the U.S. government has played probably in this process? We talk about fragmentation or deglobalization.
Well, I think the U.S. government, of course, has been the primary actor and primary cause for the deterioration in China-U.S. relations. And of course, the larger impact that is having around the world. And we can also see in the Ukrainian conflict as well that one of the prime reasons that this conflict has escalated in such an extreme way is largely due to American policy decisions. So in some sense, I think we can say that the US has been the cause of the greatest economic and political instability globally, which only shows the importance of continued dialogue and working together to mitigate some of these challenges. And I think this really is the primary challenge facing the China-US relationship, as well as the world in general.
The world in general. Steve, the Economist magazine, I think is basically responding to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, saying that in the U.S. protectionist policies and industrial policies on green transition obviously is doing damage to globalization and free trade. What do you make of that?
Look, I think it's about time damage was done to globalization and free trade. They have become sacred cows in academic and political discourse, and they are distorting what actually did happen. China, Korea, Japan all succeeded by degrees of protectionism at various points. China was actually a very successful industrialization process through encouraging American companies to relocate to China. That's been in a bit of a distinction with Korea and Japan, which did protect the local industries and then get them to be ready to compete. So the whole idea that free trade leads to innovation and growth, China's about the only one that's done it successfully with its export-oriented industrialization program. The rest of them did protect their domestic manufacturing and grew from that basis. So there's a lot of holy cow type thinking about the role of globalization, how sacrosanct it is. The most important thing we can have for the future is a robust system. And that to me means a winding back of globalization, more domestic manufacturing, and much more focus upon reducing the degree of carbon dioxide we generate. That has to be first and foremost. So all this stuff about globalization, I think it's a brief trend in human history, which could have continued if we were living on Jupiter, which is big enough to support an economy that continues polluting on the scale we are on the Earth. We don't live on Jupiter, we live on planet Earth, and we have overloaded planet Earth, and globalization has been a major part of that overload.
Well, obviously, different takes on globalization, but whatever you call it, like a globalized world or re-globalizing, de-globalization. 之前 here's another survey done by the forum actually. No, the audit firm actually, PwC, I think, for related to the forum. According to the survey, 73% of CEOs think global growth will decline this year in 2023, and 2/5 of business leaders even expressed concern their companies may not last a decade. So obviously, this is people call it the most pessimistic outlook by business leaders in 12 years. What do you make of that? So global recession inevitable, and we are on a downturn in terms of economic growth?
I should say, frankly, that there is no good policies and future for the global recession in the time to come. Especially this year is very important for all countries, and including the United States and the European countries, because the economic recession cannot be avoided at the moment. We see that so many crises happened in 1 or 2 years. We see that energy crisis, food crisis, and also immigration crisis, and also even the climate crisis. Now we have the geopolitical crisis that made all countries crazy and also in difficulties. So in this way that we don't see a good, brilliant future that in short time that this recession could be avoided. And of course, the other reason is that some major countries, especially for the United States, their internal policy is so selfish because it's only trying to protect its own interests. They didn't pay any attention what the other countries are feeling, are thinking, are doing for a better world, for a better life of the people. But the United States is always trying to decouple from other countries. They always focusing on how to retain or restrain China from its rise or the development. That's why they make the American companies also even in more difficulties than ever before. So this is the point that we don't see any optimistic signal from the United States. Even they have so many so-called laws, acts that signed by President Biden, but all these acts only try to protect its own. So its alliance in the European countries are still unhappy and disagree with their action, but nobody can help them. So we see that the future of the global recession, especially in the United States, could still seriously take place.
Well, as the largest economy in the world, yes, U.S. domestic policy usually have an impact globally. Probably so is China, the second largest economy, Andy. So Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is at the meeting. He addressed the meeting on Tuesday. He stressed that China is welcoming foreign investment, and he also mentioned about strengthening international cooperation and maintaining world peace. So cooperation, world peace, nearly a dozen times in his speech. So why was it so important for Mr. Liu He to address the forum and stress, and particularly stresses on those terms?
Well, I think it was very important for Liu He to strike this tone and to emphasize this message. Qingduo, as you said, China is the second largest economy in the world in nominal terms, but it also provides the bulk of the growth. So Ray Dalio, the legendary investor and founder of Bridgewater Associates, spoke at the Center for China Globalization last week. And I think he made a very interesting point. So he also echoed the pessimistic outlook for the global economy, with some questions about what will happen to the US economy given the continued interest rate rises by the Federal Reserve, the chaos in Europe. But he believes that China will be a bright spot for the global economy in the next several years. And I think this relates directly to Liu He's message at Davos. So first of all, without a stable, peaceful global environment, we cannot have healthy economic growth. So that is a prerequisite. So I think China increasingly shouldering its global responsibilities to promote a more peaceful and stable world is absolutely vital. But from an economic perspective, China, as Liu He said, if I can say it in slightly different words, is open for business. It's open for foreign investment, it's open for trade, and it's increasingly open for people flows as well, whether that's business executives, diplomats, students. And this is vitally important for many countries around the world that count on Chinese tourists. So I think the global economy, again, many observers, including investors like Ray Dalio, the IMF, are unfortunately quite pessimistic. But most knowledgeable observers believe that China will be a bright spot globally in 2023 and beyond. And so I think Liu He's message is a very reassuring one.
Important speeches over there. Steve, Liu He also met with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and U.S. Secretary of State Blinken is coming to China early next month, February. So we are seeing more communication, more exchanges among the senior officials from the two largest economies. Are we seeing they are, working to stabilize the relationship, which is important not only to both countries but also global peace and stability? That again, that's important for economic growth.
Well, it's important for the human civilization, let alone
That's
economic
right.
growth. And I mean, obviously, China now is the world's second most powerful country, and you have a very different history when you did have an empire. A very different history of interacting with countries which were vassals of China in those days. You didn't occupy, you didn't put military bases, et cetera, et cetera. There's a degree of wisdom to the way that China administered its empire compared to what America has done. My worries really are about America still has a very imperialistic way of treating other countries and treating China as a rival. And I would hope to see that Biden bringing some maturity to that rather than some of the foolishness we saw under Trump and previous leaders. The State Department still worries me. They still want to be dominant. They still want to be the central power. They have to realize they're sharing the world again, and they can't get rid of China the way they got rid of Russia.
Well, Steve, the things like the unipolar world is probably gone. We are seeing the rise of the rest, not only China, India, African continent, Latin America, Turkey, Indonesia, for example. Is the rise of multipolar system is here right now. How difficult for Washington to accept probably the new reality for them?
I think it'll be quite hard for them. And I had an interaction with Jeffrey Sachs some years ago over the role of the United States State Department in trying to dismantle Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And Jeffrey went in with a very, I think, naive but very genuine view that America should help Russia in the transition from socialism to capitalism. Naive it is about how to do it, but he then found the State Department saw that as a way of destroying a military rival. So there's a level of militarism, jingoism in America that still concerns me. And I would be advising China to tread carefully in negotiations with the Americans over trying to achieve a peaceful world.
Yeah, to tread carefully. Jiqian, of course, one of the priorities for the Chinese foreign policy is to deal with the U.S. But fundamentally, it's about the domestic issue, right? Domestic economy, for example. And Liu he talked about the domestic policies, for example, is that China will continue to support the private sector, promote fair competition and deepen reform at its state giants, and suggestions that it could return to a planned economy were impossible. How does this remark, or do these remarks set the tone for China's economic strategy probably for 2023 and beyond?
This remark made by Mr. Liu is very important to the global community because in the past months or the past year that many controversial discussions and opinions about China's future policy, many have doubt or the concerns that China will go back or went back to old policy as the planning economy, and also will try to suppress this non-government the business in China. So all this controversial dispute has caused some chaos and disputes among the world and also including in China. So this is very important that we had already announced during our party National Congress, the 20th session. So we have announced again that China will go further openly and will go further socialist market system. This is the fundamental for China, especially when we are talking about China-style modernization. So including all 5 major factors, one is that we still remain uphold to the market economy system. So this is a very important signal to the whole world, even also to the domestic entrepreneurs and the businessmen, that we will continue to open up our policy, open up our market. We welcome the FDI, the foreign investment in China. We should have a good cooperation and a peaceful environment, both sections. So that's why that Mr. Liu has made such announcement in good time. That is very important to please the people that in a good way, that to relax, to feel relaxing about China's future. We will still come to reform and open up further.
Well, Andy, China's Bureau of Statistics released numbers about the GDP growth, 3% last year, one of the slowest in the 50 years, or the slowest. And the FDI, foreign direct investment, rose 6.3% year on year. So at the same time, we are seeing the government is returning or is shifting its focus on the economic growth. And you are seeing numbers published by different provinces about their target for 2023. And for example, Hainan Island in the southernmost part of the country is about 9 or more than 9% for 2023. So what's your projection for the economic growth for China or the economic performance in 2023?
Sure. Well, I think last year really is an aberration because of COVID. 2023, I think we'll certainly see a rebound, meaning that growth will be higher than trend. I think what's more important, though, is to focus on the longer-term growth potential of the Chinese economy. And I want to raise 2 quick points here that I think are largely overlooked. We should not underestimate the role of arrangements like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as a catalyst for Chinese growth as well as regional growth. The second is the digital yuan and other very, very important initiatives that China is taking that I think have the potential to profoundly put the Chinese economy on a better growth track. And the last point that I think is largely misunderstood in the West is the greater role of the party in different organizations. Because one thing to point out is whether we're talking about a Fortune 500 company, a government, or a country, communication and coordination challenges are some of the biggest obstacles to effectiveness. And with the party taking a greater role, it's like a central nervous system coordinating mechanism that we've seen other success stories where industry, academia, and government have cooperated in places like the United States and the UK that have led to tremendous technological breakthroughs. And I think we're witnessing a similar strengthening of this kind of soft infrastructure that will be very positive in the long run, in the medium term and the long run for China's growth. So I think we'll see higher than trend growth in 2023 as a rebound, but there's some important structural factors, I think, that are very, very positive for China's economy in the long run.
In the long run. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.